That's right. I'm joined by Tim Adams. He's a former Undersecretary of the Treasury in the Bush administration. He's now a managing director at the Lindsay Group. He's been part of these IMF World Bank meetings many times before. You've been a negotiator for the U.S. And what's your own take on this talk of a currency war? Is there a greater threat that this is actually going to play out?
I hope not. I hope cooler heads prevail over the next 72 hours in this town. I don't think it's a war, but I do think there is enormous frustration among officials and politicians as to the inability to have a global adjustment in these imbalances. We've been talking about global imbalances now for over 5 years, and what we see is rigidities, impediments to those to that adjustment process, and it manifests itself in the kind of frustrations we're reading about in the media.
And right now there's talk about maybe the need for a new Plaza Accord, those accords, currency accords of the 80s. Dominique Strauss-Kahn says it's not going to happen, the IMF managing director today. If not Plaza, then what?
Well, it was a lot easier back in the 1980s when you could get 4 or 5 officials in a nice hotel and decide how you're going to run the world. The world is much more complex now. We certainly need institutions like the IMF. We need institutions like the G20 with leaders at its helm to try to resolve these issues. But we know what the problem is. What we need is a consensus now on how we implement the solutions in a timely fashion.
Who's on the hot seat the most? Which country, as they sit around the table over the next 72 hours or so, who's the most on the hot seat?
Well, there's a lot of hot seats. The Japanese need to explain what their strategy is. The Chinese need to maybe become a little less defensive and a little bit more explanatory about how they're going to approach their issues. The U.S. is on the hot seat. We have elections a month away. Unemployment is very high, and we need to find ways to stimulate growth. So there are a lot of people who are looking to these meetings this weekend to find solutions to these problems.
And what's your, at the end of the day, on Monday, we're going to read the headlines, accord in Washington, or are we going to see currency war escalates?
No, I think what they'll try to do, I think they'll put a nice calming sheen on the weekend's meetings. I don't think there's an accord because there's no consensus. In some ways, we'll kick this down to the G20, where the heads of state will assemble in Seoul in November. I'm not sure we'll find much agreement there either. So we have something of a muddling through strategy for the foreseeable future. I hope I'm wrong. I hope there is some sort of agreement. I doubt it.
If you're back at Treasury advising Tim Geithner right now, what's the U.S. play at these talks?
Well, I think Tim gave an excellent speech yesterday. I think he laid out their perspective that we need to remove the rigidities that are in place so that we can have a global readjustment. And part of that is to see currency appreciation in those parts of the world in which they're running surpluses, they have inflationary pressures, and they're importing our monetary policy, which is completely inappropriate for their own domestic economic conditions.
Is there any player at these talks who could rise above the fray and be the voice of reason, the adult in the room, if you will?
Well, there's lots of adults. I think everyone comes talking their own book and pursuing their own their own country's self-interest. That's not unusual. I'd love to see more leadership from China. I'd like to see more leadership from the institution itself, but I'm not sure we're going to see it in the near term.
All right. And Tim Adams, I know you've been part of these before. There's going to be no communique coming out of this, as there have been some of these other talks, a formal statement. Is that something that's going to leave this questionable as to the outcome?
Yes, it's unfortunate. A lot of people were skeptical of the usefulness, the utility of the G7 statements or a G20 communique, although G20 doesn't talk about currencies. I think at this point it would be nice to have kind of some sort of device to signal to the markets what the collective thought process is. In the absence of that, you get a number of one-off views, and from that, it's a bit of a cacophony of voices.
All right. Tim Adams, appreciate it very much. Carol, Matt, back to you in New York.